Deep in a forest that no road from the human world reaches in any way that is straightforward, there is a stone bridge that crosses a narrow river of black water. The bridge is small. It was built by hands that no chronicle records, in a time before the kingdoms whose names appear in modern histories had begun to keep their own records. It is made of pale grey stone that has, over the centuries, been so heavily covered in moss and creeping bramble that the original colour of the stone is visible only in small patches near the centre of the arch, where the constant brushing of feet has worn the moss away. The river beneath the bridge is not, in the way that rivers in the human world are rivers, fed by rain or melting snow or the patient seeping of springs. It runs from somewhere else. It runs to somewhere else. The water is cold in a way that has nothing to do with the season. Sometimes, in the deep hours of the night, the surface of the water appears to reflect things that are not above it, and to refuse to reflect things that are. For as long as anyone in the surrounding country can remember, the bridge has had a keeper. The keeper does not, in the ordinary understanding of the word, guard the bridge. The keeper does not stop those who wish to cross it. The keeper does not collect, in the ordinary understanding of the word, a toll. What the keeper does is older and stranger than any of those things. The keeper sits, every evening from dusk until dawn, on a small wooden stool at the western end of the bridge. The keeper watches who comes. The keeper sees who passes. The keeper marks, in a small leather book that has been kept by every keeper since the bridge was built, what crossed and what was paid. The keeper accepts from each traveller small particular thing that traveller is required to leave behind in order to be permitted to pass. What the travellers leave behind is not always something that they choose. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is not. Sometimes it is a coin from a country that no longer exists. Sometimes it is a memory, given over willingly, that the traveller has decided is no longer worth the weight of carrying. Sometimes it is something the traveller did not know they had been carrying until they reached the bridge, and the bridge, in its strange older way of knowing, took it from them. The keeper writes down what is left behind. The keeper places it, when it is something that can be placed, in a small wooden box that sits beside the stool. The keeper, at dawn, takes the box back to the small stone cottage that stands a short distance from the bridge, and adds the contents of the night to the larger collection that has been accumulating in that cottage for as long as the bridge has had a keeper. This is the story of one of those keepers, a young woman named Eira Mossfin, who came to the bridge in the autumn of her 20th year, who learned the duty over the course of one cold winter, and who served at the bridge for the remainder of her natural life. The story of the keeper she replaced, an old woman called only the Greymother, who had been sitting on the stool at the end of the bridge for longer than any of the people of the surrounding villages could remember, and the story of what the bridge is actually for, which is a thing the surrounding villages do not speak about openly, even though every adult in those villages knows. To begin Eira Mossfin's story, you have to begin in a small village called Thornwell, which sits at the edge of the forest, on the side of the forest that the human world considers its own. Eira had been born in Thornwell. Her family had lived there for many generations. Her father was a woodcutter who worked the eastern edge of the forest, where it was permitted for villagers to go and gather what wood and what mushrooms and what wild fruits the forest allowed them. Her mother was a weaver who took the wool of the small flocks of sheep the village kept and turned it, on a loom that had been her own mother's, into the heavy warm cloth that the people of Thornwell needed to survive their long, cold winters. Eira was the oldest of 4 children. She had a younger sister named Lynn, who was 16, and 2 younger brothers, Bram and Tane, who were 13 and 10. The family lived in a small wooden house at the edge of the village, on the side closest to the forest. Eira had grown up, all of her life, with the deep dark trees as the boundary of her known world. She had been told, all of her life, the small careful warnings that the children of Thornwell were always told. Do not enter the forest beyond the marked stones. Do not take anything from the forest that has not been gathered in daylight, with the proper words said before the gathering. Do not, under any circumstances, follow any voice or light into the forest at night, no matter how familiar the voice or how warm the light might seem. These warnings had been, in Eira's childhood, a kind of background presence rather than a daily concern. She had not known anyone in her young life who had been hurt by the forest. The villages along the eastern edge of the forest had been respecting the old rules for many generations. They knew where to step. They knew where not to step. They knew, in the old wisdom that had been handed down through their grandmothers, how to live alongside something that they did not understand and did not, in any meaningful sense, control. But Eira had also known all of her life that the forest was not simply a forest. She had known this in the way that children of certain places know certain things. From the way her parents fell silent on certain evenings, when the wind moved in particular ways through the trees beyond the eastern fence of their property. From the way the village old people gathered on the 4 nights of the year that the calendars of Thornwell marked as the most dangerous, in the small stone hall at the center of the village, and stayed there together until dawn. From the small offerings that her mother left, every spring and every autumn, on the flat stone at the edge of the village territory, food and small handmade items that were always gone by morning, and that no one ever asked about, and that no one ever found taken by any animal whose tracks could be identified. The forest was, in the daily life of Thornwell, both ordinary and not ordinary. It was a thing the village lived beside. It was also a thing the village had agreed, over many generations, to a particular kind of arrangement with. The keeper of the bridge was, in some way that the children of Thornwell understood without ever being directly told, an essential part of that arrangement. Eira had seen the previous keeper only once in her life. It had been when she was perhaps 7 years old. The Greymother, as she was called by everyone in the village, had come into Thornwell on a morning in early spring, walking up the path from the forest, leaning on a long wooden staff. She had been in Eira's memory of the encounter, very small and very old. Her hair had been the color of new ash. Her eyes had been a very pale blue. She had spoken to Eira's mother for perhaps an hour, in the kitchen of their small wooden house, while Eira had played with Lynn in the room next door and listened, without quite meaning to the conversation through the thin wall. The conversation had been about ordinary things, about the harvest, about the flock, about the children. The Greymother had asked careful questions about Eira's mother's family, about the 4 generations of Mossfins who had lived in Thornwell, about the women in particular of the family. The conversation had not, on the surface, been unusual, but there had been, in the way the Greymother had asked her questions, something that Eira's young attention had caught even through the wall. A kind of weighing, a kind of evaluation. When the Greymother had left that morning, Eira's mother had stood in the doorway of the small wooden house and watched the small old woman walk back down the path toward the forest until she had disappeared between the trees. Then Eira's mother had sat down at the kitchen table very slowly and had put her face in her hands and had stayed that way for a long time. Eira had not, that day or in any of the years that followed, asked her mother what the conversation had been about. She had understood, in the way that children sometimes understand things, that it was not a question to ask. But 13 years later, in the autumn of her 20th year, when the messenger came up the path from the forest, Eira knew, before the messenger had said anything, what the message was. The messenger came on a clear, cool morning in late September. Eira was working in the small garden at the back of her family's house, harvesting the last of the autumn vegetables. She heard, before she saw, the soft sound of footsteps on the path. She looked up. The messenger was standing at the edge of the garden, watching her. The messenger was not, in any way that Eira could afterward describe, ordinary. He was tall. He was dressed in dark grey clothing of a cut that did not match any of the cuts of clothing made in Thornwell. His skin was very pale, almost the color of birch bark. His hair was long and black and tied back with a simple cord. His eyes, when they looked at Eira across the garden, were a deep amber color that Eira had never seen in any human eyes. He did not speak immediately. He stood at the edge of the garden, watching her. He waited, in some way Eira understood without being able to articulate, for her to acknowledge that she had seen him and to come to him. She put down her gardening basket. She walked slowly across the small autumn garden to the edge of the path where the messenger stood. She did not feel afraid, exactly. She felt the way a person feels when she's approaching something that the world has decided will determine the shape of the rest of her life. There was, in her stomach, a kind of cold settling. When she reached the messenger, he looked at her with his amber eyes, and he said, in a voice that was neither warm nor cold, that the Greymother was ready to leave the bridge. He said that the village of Thornwell had, in its arrangements with the forest, agreed to provide a new keeper. He said that the choice of keeper was not, in the strictest sense, the village choice. The choice had been made by the bridge itself, in whatever way the bridge made such choices. The bridge had chosen Eira Mossfin. He said that Eira had 3 days to prepare. On the morning of the 3rd day, he would return. He would walk her into the forest. He would walk her to the bridge. The Greymother would meet her there. The Greymother would teach her, over the course of 1 winter, the duties of the keeper. And then, when the Greymother judged that the teaching was complete, Eira would become the keeper, and the Greymother would walk back across the bridge, and would go to whatever place the keepers of the bridge go when they have finished their service. The messenger said all of this in the same neutral voice, as if he were reciting a small, ordinary fact about weather. When he had finished, he looked at Eira for a long moment with his deep amber eyes, and he asked her if she had any questions. Eira had many questions. She did not, in the moment, ask any of them. She understood that the questions she had were not, in the strictest sense, questions that the messenger was offering to answer. The offer of questions had been a courtesy. The choice of keeper had already been made. She said, in a voice that was steadier than she had expected it to be, that she would be ready in 3 days. The messenger nodded once. He turned. He walked back down the path, into the forest, until he had disappeared between the trees. Eira stood at the edge of the garden for a long time after he had gone. The autumn sun was warm on her shoulders. The vegetables in the basket she had set down were drying out in the morning light. Somewhere in the village behind her, she could hear the small, ordinary sounds of life. A child laughing, a door closing, a dog barking at something it had seen in the road. She walked back into the small wooden house. She found her mother in the kitchen, kneading dough at the wooden table. Her mother looked up when Eira came in. Her mother saw, in Eira's face, what had happened. Her mother put down the dough. Her mother sat down at the table. Her mother covered her face with her flour-dusted hands and began, very quietly, to cry. Eira sat down at the table next to her mother. She put her hand on her mother's shoulder. She did not, at first, say anything. After a long time, her mother lowered her hands. Her eyes were red, but her face had become, in the way that her mother's face sometimes became, very steady. She said that she had been preparing herself for this moment for 13 years. Since the morning the Greymother had come into the kitchen and had asked her questions about the women of the Mossfin family. She said that she had hoped, in the years between, that the choice would not fall on her oldest daughter. She had hoped, in the years between, that the bridge would, for whatever reasons the bridge made its choices, choose someone else. But it had not chosen someone else. It had chosen Eira. She said that she could tell Eira now the things she had not been able to tell her before. She could tell her now what the bridge actually was. She could tell her now what the keeper actually did. She could tell her now the things that the women of Thornwell told their daughters only on the morning the messenger came. Eira's mother got up from the kitchen table. She went to the small wooden chest in the corner of the kitchen that had stood there, in that corner, for as long as Eira could remember. She opened the chest. She took out from the bottom of it a small leather book. The book was old. It was the color of dark honey. It had been, Eira's mother said, in the family for many generations. She put the book on the table in front of Eira. She said that this book was the family's record. Each woman of the Mossfin family who had ever served as the keeper of the bridge had left, in this book, a small careful account of what she had learned during her service. The book had been started, Eira's mother said, by Eira's great-great-great-great-grandmother in a year that was now beyond easy reckoning. The book had been added to by various keepers of the family in the centuries since. Eira had not known, until that morning, that there had been keepers of the bridge in her own family. The arrangement, her mother said, was not predictable in that way. The bridge chose whom it chose. Some generations of the family produced no keeper. Some generations produced one. The pattern, if there was a pattern, was not one that the family had ever been able to discern. But when the bridge chose someone from the Mossfin family, the new keeper was given the book, so that she would know, before she went to the bridge, that she was not the first of her family to do this work, so that she would know that her grandmothers had walked the same path, so that she would know, in whatever small comfort the knowledge could offer, that she was not alone. Eira opened the book. She began, in the autumn afternoon light of the small wooden house in the village of Thornwell, to read. 3 days later, in the cool grey light of a late September morning, the messenger came again. He came up the path from the forest at the same hour he had come the first time. He stood at the edge of the small wooden house. He waited for Eira to come out. Eira had spent the 3 days preparing in the way her mother had told her to prepare. She had packed, in a single canvas bag, the things that the keeper's book had said a new keeper should bring. A change of warm clothing, a few small personal items, a wooden bowl, a wooden spoon, and a small knife. Nothing else. The book itself she had wrapped in oilcloth and placed at the bottom of the bag. The bridge would, the book had told her, provide what else she needed. She had said her goodbyes the previous evening. Her mother had cried again, but more quietly this time. Her father had held her for a long time without speaking. Lynn, who was old enough to understand what was happening, had given her a small carved wooden bird that had been her own favourite childhood possession, and had asked Eira to take it with her to the bridge, so that something of Lynn would be there. Bram and Tane, who were not quite old enough to understand, had cried in the way that small children cry when they sense that something serious is happening even though they do not entirely know what. When the morning came, Eira had got up before dawn. She had eaten the breakfast her mother had prepared. She had stood at the small window of the kitchen and watched the first grey light come up over the village. She had felt, sitting at the table, a strange combination of fear and a kind of clarity. The decision had been made for her. There was, in some sense, nothing for her to decide. All she had to do now was walk the path that had been laid out and learn what was to be learned and become what she was to become. When she came out of the house, the messenger was waiting. He looked at her bag. He nodded once. He turned, and he began to walk back down the path toward the forest. Eira followed. She did not look back at the house. The walk into the forest took most of the morning. The path the messenger followed was not, at first, a path that Eira recognized. It was not the eastern path that the woodcutters of the village used. It was not the southern path that the gatherers used in summer. It was a different path entirely, one that ran in a direction Eira had not previously known there was a path in. The trees, as the messenger and Eira walked deeper into the forest, became older. The light, filtering down through the leaves, became thinner and bluer. The sounds of the village, which Eira had been able to hear for the first hour of the walk, faded entirely. After some time, the messenger and Eira passed a row of standing stones that Eira had seen drawings of in the old books in the village hall, but had never actually visited. The stones marked, the books had said, the boundary between the part of the forest that the human world considered its own and the part of the forest that belonged to something else. Eira had been told, all her childhood, that no person from Thornwell could pass beyond those stones and return. The messenger walked between two of the stones without slowing. After a moment of hesitation, Eira followed. She felt, as she stepped between the stones, a small but distinct change. The air on the other side was cooler. The colors, somehow, were richer. The light had taken on a slightly different quality, a quality she could not quite name. The trees, which had already been ancient, became impassably older. Their trunks, the messenger and Eira passed, were sometimes wider than the small wooden house Eira had grown up in. Their branches, in the high distance overhead, formed a kind of cathedral roof of leaves and branches that filtered the daylight into something dim and patterned. The messenger continued to walk without speaking. Eira continued to follow. After several more hours of walking, in the early afternoon, the messenger and Eira came to a small clearing. At the center of the clearing was a small stone cottage, very old, with a slate roof that was thick with moss, and a chimney from which a thin line of smoke rose into the still air. Beyond the cottage, perhaps 30 paces further into the clearing, was a stream of black water that ran from somewhere deep in the trees on the right and disappeared into the trees on the left. And spanning the stream, at the place where the path met it, was a small stone bridge. The bridge. Eira stopped at the edge of the clearing. She looked at the bridge for a long time. It was, in some sense, exactly what the keeper's book had described. A small grey stone arch, heavily covered in moss and creeping bramble, spanning a narrow river of black water. There was a small wooden stool at the western end of the bridge, on the side near the cottage. There was a small wooden box beside the stool. There was an old leather-bound book on the stool itself, closed, waiting. There was also, sitting on the stool, the Greymother. She was even smaller than Eira remembered her from the visit 13 years before. Her hair was the same color of new ash. Her eyes, when she looked across the clearing at Eira, were the same very pale blue. She was wearing a long grey dress that seemed to have been made from the same material as the moss on the bridge. She held, across her lap, the long wooden staff Eira remembered. The messenger walked Eira to within a few paces of the stool. Then he turned, and without any further word or gesture, he walked back across the bridge and into the forest on the other side and disappeared between the trees. The Greymother and Eira looked at each other for a long, quiet moment in the autumn afternoon. The Greymother said, in a soft voice that was older than any voice Eira had ever heard, that Eira should put down her bag and come and sit beside her. They had a great deal to talk about, the Greymother said, before the night came. Eira put down her bag. She walked the last few paces to the stool. There was a smaller second stool, she now saw, that had been placed beside the Greymother's. Eira sat down. The Greymother's first words to her, sitting together at the western end of the bramble bridge in the dim afternoon light of the deep forest, were the words that Eira would think about, in different ways, for the rest of her long service. The Greymother said that the bridge was very old. The bridge was older than any human kingdom. The bridge had been built, not by humans, but by something that had needed a place where the world above and the world below could meet without violence. The river beneath the bridge, the Greymother said, was the boundary between those two worlds. The black water was the substance of the boundary itself. To cross the bridge, in either direction, was to pass from one world to the other. The keeper of the bridge, the Greymother said, was not the guardian of the bridge in any strong sense. The keeper did not have the power to stop those who wished to cross. The keeper did not have the power to determine who was permitted and who was not. Those decisions had been made in some way that the keepers did not fully understand before the bridge had ever been built. The decisions had been made by the same thing that had built the bridge for the same reasons that had built it. The keeper's role, the Greymother said, was to be present, to be, on the human side of the bridge, a witness, to accept from each traveler who crossed the small particular thing that traveler was required to leave, to record in the book what had been left and by whom and on what night, to carry at dawn what had been left back to the cottage and to add it to the larger collection that had been growing there for as long as the bridge had had a keeper. The travelers were of many kinds, the Greymother said. Some were creatures of the world below. They came across the bridge into the upper world for reasons of their own, reasons that the keeper did not need to know. They paid their tolls in things that they had brought with them, and they continued on their way, into whatever business in the upper world they had come for, and they would return in their own time by the same bridge, and they would pay another toll on their return. Some were creatures of the upper world. They came to the bridge to cross into the world below. These were rarer. They came, usually because they had agreed to a bargain. They had been promised something by some creature of the world below in exchange for something else they were carrying. The toll in their case was that something else. The keeper would receive it and would record it, and the traveler would cross, and would or would not return, depending on the terms of the bargain. Some were neither creatures of the world above nor of the world below. They were something else. They were, the Greymother said, things that walked between the two worlds because they belonged to neither. The keeper would learn to recognize these things over the course of her service. The keeper would learn that they were not, in most cases, dangerous to a keeper who knew what to do. The keeper would also learn, the Greymother said, that they were not, in most cases, things that should be addressed by their names. Their names, even when the keeper learned them, were not for speaking aloud. The Greymother said many other things that first afternoon. She explained the small details of the duty, where the wooden box was kept, how the book was used, what words to say when a traveler approached, what words not to say, what gestures to use, what gestures to avoid, where to look, where not to look. The forest at the bridge, the Greymother said, was older than the rules of human politeness. The keeper had to learn the older rules, the rules of the forest, the rules of what the bridge actually was. These rules were not, the Greymother said, complicated, but they were absolute. A keeper who broke them did not, ordinarily, get a second chance to do better. By the time the Greymother had finished speaking, the autumn afternoon had begun to fade. The light in the clearing had become cool and blue. The black water beneath the bridge had begun, in some way Eira could see but not quite describe, to look more alert than it had looked earlier in the day. The Greymother said that they would now have a small meal in the cottage. After the meal, they would return to the bridge, and the night's work would begin. That night was the first of the nights that Eira would spend at the Bramble Bridge. The first traveller of the night came perhaps an hour after the last of the daylight had faded. Eira heard him before she saw him. He came from the direction of the world below, from the far side of the bridge. His footsteps were light and uneven, in a rhythm that did not match the rhythm of human walking. As he stepped onto the bridge, the small lantern that hung at the center of the arch flickered, casting a moment of pale silver light across his form, and Eira saw him for the first time. He was tall. His skin was the color of damp bark. His face was almost human, but not quite, the proportions of his eyes and his mouth slightly off in a way that Eira's mind tried briefly to correct, and then accepted. He wore a long coat made of overlapping leaves, layered like the scales of a fish. He carried in his right hand a small wooden box. He walked across the bridge slowly. At the western end, in front of the stools where Eira and the Greymother sat, he stopped. The Greymother spoke a few words in a language Eira did not recognize. The bark-skinned man answered in the same language. The exchange was brief. After it was completed, the man held out his small wooden box, and the Greymother took it, and the man bowed his strange, almost human head once, and walked past the stools, and disappeared down the path into the forest on the human side of the river. The Greymother opened the small wooden box. Inside it was a single dried leaf, the color of old gold, with veins that glowed faintly in the dim light. She showed it to Eira. She said that this kind of leaf came only from a particular tree in a particular grove of the world below. She said that it was the kind of toll that this kind of traveller had agreed long ago to pay each time he crossed. She said that the leaves were stored, in the cottage, in a particular drawer that Eira would learn about in the morning. She closed the box. She placed it in the larger wooden box beside the stool. She opened the leather-bound book on her own lap, took up a small quill that lay beside it, and wrote, in careful old-fashioned handwriting, a brief entry. First traveller of Eira's service had passed. Over the course of the long autumn night that followed, Eira watched the Greymother accept the tolls of 7 more travellers. Each was different. Each carried a different kind of payment. Each spoke a different language with the Greymother, or did not speak at all. One was a small creature, no larger than a cat, with too many legs and a face that Eira tried not to look at directly. One was a woman, almost completely human in appearance, who left, as her toll, a single tear that she pressed into a tiny glass vial and gave to the Greymother in silence. One was something so tall that it had to bend nearly double to fit beneath the arch of the bridge, and that left, as its toll, a sound rather than an object, a single low note that the Greymother caught in a small wooden flute that she kept beside her stool for exactly this purpose. By dawn, when the eastern sky began to lighten and the last of the night's travellers had passed, the wooden box beside the Greymother's stool was nearly full. The Greymother stood up, stiffly, and gestured for Eira to follow her. They walked together to the small stone cottage in the clearing. They went inside. The cottage was warm. There was a small fire burning in the hearth that the Greymother had banked before leaving for the bridge. There was a kettle of water that had been kept warm beside the fire. The Greymother poured them both small wooden cups of strong dark tea. They sat at a small wooden table near the fire. The Greymother began, slowly, to teach Eira the second part of the duty. The sorting of the night's tolls. The placing of each kind of object in its proper container, in its proper drawer, in its proper place in the larger collection that filled, Eira now saw, almost every shelf and every cupboard, and every corner of the small stone cottage. The cottage, the Greymother said, was the actual purpose of the bridge. Eira, sitting at the table with her hands wrapped around the warm wooden cup, did not at first understand. She asked the Greymother what she meant. The Greymother said that the bridge existed so that the things that needed to pass between the worlds could pass without harm. The keeper accepted the tolls so that the passage could be paid for. The cottage existed because the tolls had to go somewhere. The tolls were not, the Greymother said, simply objects. They were in some sense that was difficult to explain in human language, the small particular things that the worlds owed to each other. The leaves, the tears, the notes, the coins, the memories, the bargained items. Each was a small piece of one world that had been given in exchange for passage to the other. The cottage, the Greymother said, was the place where these pieces were held. The keeper was their guardian. The collection grew and grew over the centuries. It did not, the Greymother said, ever leave the cottage. The keepers came and went, but the collection remained. It would remain, the Greymother said, for as long as the bridge stood. And the bridge would stand, the Greymother said, for as long as there were people willing to keep it. Eira finished her tea slowly. The first morning of her service was lightening into full day outside the small windows of the cottage. The Greymother had begun, with the tired, careful movements of a very old woman who had done the work many thousands of times, to sort the night's tolls into their proper places. Eira stood up to help her. She had, she understood, a great deal to learn, but she had also, she understood, begun. The winter that followed Eira's arrival at the Bramble Bridge was the most difficult and the most beautiful winter she would ever experience. It was difficult because the work was difficult. The nights were long, the cold was deep. The travellers in winter were sometimes more numerous and sometimes more strange than the travellers of other seasons. Eira learned, slowly, the rhythms that the Greymother had been working to for many decades. She learned the small particular postures that allowed a person to sit still on a wooden stool for 10 hours at a time without becoming unable to move. She learned the small particular arts of staying alert through the deep hours of the night, when the body wanted, more than anything else, to lie down and sleep. She learned, most importantly, the careful absolute attention that the work required. The keeper of the bridge could not, in any meaningful sense, look away. It was beautiful because the forest, in winter, became something Eira had not previously known a forest could be. The first heavy snow fell in early November, a snow so deep that the entire clearing was covered, by morning, in a thick, smooth blanket of white that the Greymother and Eira had to push aside, with shovels, in order to reach the bridge. The snow continued, in the weeks that followed, to fall and fall. It built up on the slate roof of the cottage. It built up on the moss of the bridge. It transformed the dark forest into something pale and luminous and silent in a way that no painting Eira had ever seen had been able to capture. In the deep, clear nights of the winter, when the sky above the clearing was visible between the high branches of the trees, the stars were closer than Eira had ever seen them in Thornwell. The light from the lantern at the center of the bridge mixed with the light of the stars, and reflected from the snow in a way that made the entire clearing glow with a pale silver radiance, in which the strange travellers who came to the bridge took on, for a few brief moments at the center of their crossing, the appearance of figures from a story that was being told for the first time. Eira learned the language of the bridge in those months, not the spoken language, which the Greymother eventually taught her in pieces, but the deeper language of the bridge itself. The way the black water beneath the arch moved differently on different nights. The way the lantern at the center brightened, faintly, just before a particular kind of traveller arrived. The way certain travellers needed to be greeted in particular ways, with particular gestures, while other travellers preferred to be met with silence and stillness. The whole vast network of small particular customs that had grown up around the bridge in the centuries of its existence, and that the keeper, in her service, became the temporary holder of. She also learned the small dangers of the duty. There were nights when the bridge produced travellers that the Greymother spoke about more carefully than usual. Travellers whose proper greeting required the keeper to stand from her stool, to bow her head, and to say a particular phrase before any toll could be accepted. Travellers whose tolls had to be placed not in the wooden box beside the stool, but in a separate small iron box that was kept buried under a particular flat stone near the cottage, and that was not, under any circumstances, ever to be opened by the keeper after the toll had been placed inside it. There were other nights, the Greymother told her, when the keeper would have to refuse a traveller, when something would come to the bridge that did not belong on either side, that had not been authorized by the older agreements. The keeper would know, when this happened, in some way that was difficult to describe in human language. The keeper would know, and the keeper would, in those moments, have to do something that the Greymother could not entirely teach her. The keeper would have to stand from a stool. The keeper would have to refuse passage. The keeper would have to do this in a particular way that depended on what was attempting to cross. The Greymother could only tell Eira in those teaching nights that when such a moment came, Eira would know what to do, in the same way that all the keepers before her had known what to do. Eira hoped, through the winter, that no such moment would come during her training. None did. The travellers of that winter were all, in their various strange ways, ordinary. They paid their tolls, they crossed, they went on their way. The Greymother sat beside Eira every night, watching, occasionally murmuring small instructions, occasionally laughing with a small dry laugh at things that had happened 100 years earlier and that some current traveller's appearance reminded her of. The Greymother and Eira became, over the months of the winter, something that was almost like friends, though the word was perhaps not quite right for what they became. The Greymother had been at the bridge for a very long time. She did not, in the ordinary sense, have a personal life that Eira could ask her about. But she had stories. She had, in the small careful evenings when the night's work had finished and the morning's sorting was being done, observations and reflections and small pieces of wisdom that she shared with Eira in the dim warm kitchen of the cottage. She told Eira about the keepers who had come before her, about a keeper named Ussa Brenfell who had served at the bridge in the early 1700s, who had been a quiet woman from a fishing village on the far western coast, who had kept the most beautiful small carvings as a hobby in her free time, and whose carvings were still, the Greymother said, in a particular drawer in the cottage. About a keeper named Marin Arve, who had served in the early 1800s, who had been the only keeper in the recorded history of the bridge to fall in love with one of the travellers, a young man of the world below who had crossed the bridge on the same night every month for 30 years. The Greymother did not tell Eira the ending of that story. She said only, with a small, dry smile, some of the books in the cottage small library had been written by Marin Arve in the long years of her service, and that Eira would have a chance to read them if she chose. The Greymother told Eira, also, about her own predecessors, about the women who had taught her when she had first come to the bridge in a year so long ago that the Greymother no longer attempted to specify it precisely, about the things that the duty had taught her, about the small ways the duty changed a keeper over the long years in ways that no keeper could resist or control. She did not tell Eira, in those evenings, what would happen to her after she left the bridge. Eira did not ask. She understood, in the way that one understands certain things without needing to be told, that the question was not one the Greymother would answer. The teaching took, in the end, almost the entire winter. By the time the first signs of spring began to appear in the deep forest, in the late February of Eira's first year of service, the Greymother declared, on a morning over their dark tea in the cottage kitchen, that Eira was ready. The Greymother said that there was no formal ceremony for the handover. There never had been, in the centuries of the bridge's existence. There would simply be one last night, on which the Greymother would sit beside Eira at the bridge, and at the end of that night, when the dawn came, the Greymother would walk across the bridge into the world below, and Eira would remain on the human side, and the duty would have passed. Eira asked the Greymother, on that morning, what would happen to her after she crossed. The Greymother looked at her for a long moment with her very pale blue eyes. She said that she did not entirely know. She said that there were certain things the keepers were promised in exchange for their service, and that those things were waiting for her on the other side. She said that the things were good things. She said that she had been looking forward, for many decades, to receiving them. But she said also, with the careful honesty that had been one of her qualities all winter, that she did not have direct knowledge of what those things actually were. She had only the promise. She trusted the promise. The promise was very old, and it had been kept, in the case of every keeper who had ever crossed, in some manner. Eira nodded. She did not press the question further. The last night came on a clear, cool evening in late February. The snow was beginning, slowly, to recede. The clearing was full of small, bare patches of dark earth between the white. The black water beneath the bridge moved with a slightly different quality, the water of the boundary subtly reflecting the slow turning of the seasons in the upper world. Eira and the Greymother lit the lantern at the center of the bridge at dusk, as they had lit it together every evening of the winter. They sat down on their two stools at the western end. The book lay open between them. The wooden barks waited beside Eira's stool. The night's work began. There were 9 travellers that night. Each came in turn. Each was greeted in his or her or its proper manner. Each paid the proper toll. Each crossed and continued on their way. The Greymother spoke a little, during the slow gaps between travellers, of small things, about the spring that would come, about the small wild flowers that would, in March and April, begin to appear at the edges of the clearing, about the way the forest changed, in the warmer months, in ways that Eira had not yet seen. She did not, on that last night, give Eira any final speech or final piece of advice. She had given her advice, in pieces, over the entire winter. There was no need to summarize it now. When the dawn came, the Greymother stood up from her stool. She handed Eira the long wooden staff that she had carried for as long as Eira had known her. She said that the staff had belonged to all of the keepers in succession, going back perhaps to the very first. Eira would carry it now. When Eira's own time came, Eira would pass it on. The Greymother walked slowly across the bridge. Eira stood at the western end of the bridge and watched her go. At the center of the bridge, beneath the silver lantern, the Greymother paused. She turned. She looked back at Eira for a long moment, with her very pale blue eyes in the cool dawn light. She did not wave. She did not say anything. She simply looked. Whatever she communicated, in that long, silent look across the center of the bridge, was something that Eira would think about, in different ways, for the rest of her long life. Then the Greymother turned again, and walked the rest of the way across the bridge, and into the trees on the far side, and disappeared between them. Eira stood at the western end of the bridge for a very long time after the Greymother was gone. The morning brightened around her. The lantern at the center of the bridge dimmed, in the way it always dimmed when the dawn came. Birds, somewhere in the high branches of the deep forest, began their first thin singing of the day. The snow on the moss of the bridge began very slowly to soften. Eira held the long wooden staff in both of her hands. She felt the weight of it. She felt the smooth grain of the wood that had been polished, by other hands, over many centuries. She walked back to the cottage. She made herself a cup of dark tea. She sat at the small wooden kitchen table where the Greymother had taught her so many small particular things. She drank her tea slowly. She thought about her family, in the village of Thornwell, which she had left behind in the autumn, and which she would never see again, except, perhaps once or twice, on the rare occasions when keepers were permitted to return briefly to the world they had come from. She thought about Lynn, who would be growing into a young woman, about Bram and Tane, who would be growing into young men, about her parents, who would be growing older and who would, in their own time, meet whatever endings were given to them. She thought also about the long years that lay ahead of her, about the bridge, about the travellers who would come every night for as long as she remained, about the cottage and the slowly growing collection of tolls, about the slow accumulation of her own service, in the same patient, careful way that the Greymother's service had accumulated over the decades that had been hers. Eira Mossfin served at the Bramble Bridge for 4 to 7 years. In those 4 to 7 years, she greeted thousands of travellers. She accepted thousands of tolls. She added thousands of objects to the slowly growing collection in the cottage. She wrote, in careful old-fashioned handwriting, in the leather-bound book of the keepers, the small particular records of every night of her service. She lived through 4 to 7 autumns and 4 to 7 winters in the deep forest, in the small stone cottage at the edge of the clearing, in the long, quiet companionship of the bridge and the river of black water and the stars that came down close to the earth in the cold, clear nights. She did, in those 4 to 7 years, have to refuse passage 3 times. Each of those 3 times, she did what was required, in the way the Greymother had told her she would know how to do. She does not, in the entries she wrote in the book afterward, describe what she did. The book of the keepers, in those entries, simply records that a thing had come and had not been permitted and had been turned back. The exact nature of those refusals is the kind of knowledge that is held only by the keepers. It is one of the things, perhaps, that the bridge promises to those who keep it, the knowledge of how to refuse when refusal is necessary. In the autumn of her 67th year, when Eira had begun to feel, in the small quiet ways that an aging keeper feels these things, that her time at the bridge was approaching its end, she sent a message back to Thornwell, by the same kind of messenger who had originally come for her, requesting that the next keeper be selected. The bridge, in whatever way the bridge made such selections, chose a young man named Halloweenies, who was the great-great-grandson of one of Lynn's children, and who had been born in Thornwell 16 years after Eira had left it. Hallow was 20 years old when he came to the bridge in the autumn of Eira's 67th year. He was tall and thoughtful. His eyes were the same color as Lynn's eyes had been, in the small carved wooden bird that Eira had kept on the windowsill of the cottage for nearly 5 decades. The resemblance was strong enough that Eira, when she first saw Hallow walking up the path with the messenger, knew immediately who his ancestor must have been. She did not, when she greeted him, mention this. She had been the keeper for 4 to 7 years. She had learned in that time that some kinds of recognition are best left for the keeper to discover slowly, in her own time, as she settles into the duty. She handed Halloweenies the small wooden bird on the night before she crossed the bridge, without explaining what it was or how it had come to be in the cottage. Hallow set it on the same windowsill where Eira had kept it. He would, in his own time, perhaps, learn what it was, or perhaps he would not. The bird would simply be in the cottage, as so many of the small particular objects of previous keepers were in the cottage, waiting for whoever might need them. In the spring of her 68th year, on a clear, cool morning, when the snow had nearly finished receding from the clearing, Eira Mossfin walked across the bramble bridge for the first and last time in her life. Halloweenies stood at the western end of the bridge and watched her go. The lantern at the center of the bridge glowed in the cool dawn light with its pale silver flame. The black water moved beneath the arch in the slow, steady way it had moved beneath the arch on all of the nights of Eira's service. At the center of the bridge, beneath the lantern, Eira paused. She turned. She looked back at Halloweenies for a long moment, with her own grey-blue eyes that had, over the long decades, become very nearly the color of the Greymother's. She did not wave. She did not say anything. Whatever she communicated, in that long, silent look across the center of the bridge, was something Halloweenies would think about in different ways for the rest of his long life. Then Eira turned again and walked the rest of the way across the bridge and into the trees on the far side, and disappeared between them. The bramble bridge continues, in the deep forest beyond the standing stones, to do what it has always done. The travelers come. The tolls are paid. The book is kept. The collection grows slowly in the small stone cottage at the edge of the clearing. The keepers come and serve and cross and disappear into whatever waits for them on the other side. Somewhere in the cottage, on a small windowsill in a kitchen that has been warmed by the same fire for hundreds of years, a small carved wooden bird that was given by one little girl to her older sister on the night before that older sister left her family forever still rests, watching over a duty that began long before the bird was carved, and that will continue long after the bird has finally crumbled into nothing. The bridge will stand, the old keepers said, for as long as there are people willing to keep it. May the keepers always come. May the tolls always be paid. May the long, quiet work of the bridge continue in the deep forest beyond the standing stones, for as long as there is a world that needs it. Good night.